I still remember the old days back in the village when everything seemed so simple. Life was different back then, slower, quieter. We didn't have much. Just thatch roofs over our heads, wooden walls to keep out the wind, and fields stretching far beyond where the eye could see. It was peaceful, mostly. We'd wake up to the sounds of the village roosters, help our families in the fields, and play in the afternoons. But even in that peaceful life, there was always something lurking in the back of our minds, something that felt like it didn't belong. You could sense it in the stillness of the night, in the wind that would whistle through the trees. We called it Nyug. People said it was a bird, but I don't know if calling it a bird was right. It was more like a shadow that knew how to fly, with eyes that could see deep into your soul. We all grew up hearing the stories. My mum used to warn me about it all the time, telling me never to wander too far from home at night, never to answer if I heard someone call my name 3 times, not unless you could see the person. If you heard your name and answered and no one was there, that was Nyug. It could mimic voices, make you think it was someone you knew, but it wasn't. They said that if Nyug called your name 3 times and you answered it, it could come down and take your soul. At first, nothing would happen. You'd go on with your day, but then, after a few nights, you'd get sick. And after that, well, there wasn't much anyone could do. You'd be gone. Everyone in the village had a story about someone who had fallen victim to Nyug. It was like a curse, something you couldn't outrun. In the dark, when the wind would pick up and the air got colder, you could sometimes hear it. Something huge, flapping in the air above us. You never saw it. Nobody ever did. But you'd hear the wings. They were heavy, slow, like something massive was passing through the sky, just out of sight. And then, after the flapping faded, there'd be this cry, this weird, eerie bird cry. It would echo across the village, carrying with it a sense of relief. At least for some of us. You see, people in the village believed that if you heard the birds cry, you were safe. It was almost like a warning, or a signal that Nyug wasn't after you that night. It was unsettling, sure, but it was something we learned to live with. We'd hear it, then try to forget about it and go back to sleep. But if you didn't hear the cry at all, or worse, if the bird's cry wasn't a cry but your name, then you knew you were in trouble, because that meant you were Nyug's target. I didn't think much of it when I was a kid. It was one of those things you hear over and over again, but it feels so far away, like a bad dream someone else had. But then it happened to my best friend. His name was Peng. We did everything together. When we weren't helping out at home, we'd be running through the fields, swimming in the river, or climbing trees. He was the kind of friend who made everything fun. The kind of guy who could make you laugh, even when there was nothing to laugh about. We were just kids, you know? Just 2 boys trying to pass the time in a village where nothing ever really changed. One night, Peng came to visit us. We were all sitting outside, enjoying the cool evening breeze. The sun had set, and the sky was a dark velvet dotted with stars. We were chatting, laughing, and just enjoying the company. But then, as the night deepened, I heard it, the flapping sound. It was so loud it felt like the air was being stirred by some massive creature. We all fell silent, our heads turning towards the sky, trying to spot whatever it was. Then came the cry. It was that same eerie, haunting call that would send shivers down your spine. We all sighed with relief when we heard it. Just a cry. It wasn't calling out any names, and for a moment we were safe. But then, out of nowhere, Peng suddenly turned his head towards the empty field behind us and shouted, "What is it, Dad?" His voice was full of surprise, like he was genuinely asking a question. I froze, feeling my blood run cold. There was no one there. The field was completely empty, just dark shadows stretching out into the night. I looked around frantically, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing. What did you hear?" I asked, my voice shaking. Peng turned back to me, looking confused. "Didn't you hear him?" he asked, his brow furrowed like I was the crazy one. "My dad, he called my name." I couldn't speak. My mind raced, putting the pieces together. If Nyug had cried 3 times, and he had, Then Peng didn't hear his dad. He had heard Li Yu. But instead of hearing that terrible, echoing bird cry, Peng heard his father's voice. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My chest tightened and I could barely breathe. Li Yu had called his name. Peng didn't know it yet, but I did. He was the target. It was as if Li Yu had tricked him, making him hear his father's voice instead of the cry that would have warned him. My best friend was being hunted, and he didn't even realize it. At that moment, I saw something change in Peng's eyes. It was like a flicker of recognition, like he finally understood what had just happened. His face went pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he stared off into the distance where he thought he had heard his dad. He was shaking, trying to steady his breathing, but it was no use. That wasn't my dad, was it? He finally whispered, his voice small and trembling. I didn't need to say anything. The look on my face must have been enough. Peng's shoulders slumped, and he lowered his head, rubbing his face with his hands like he was trying to wake himself from a bad dream. Oh no, he muttered under his breath, his voice shaky. No, no, no. I reached out, gripping his arm, trying to offer some comfort, but I didn't know what to say. We both knew what was coming. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with fear, as if hoping that I could somehow make it all better. But I couldn't. His face was pale, almost ghostly under the moonlight. His eyes were wide, staring straight ahead, but there was something in them, something I had never seen before, a kind of fear, mixed with resignation. Are you okay? I asked, my voice filling with fear. Peng didn't answer. He just sat there, shivering slightly, his gaze fixed on the distance. The air around us felt heavy, like it was waiting for something. Then suddenly, I heard it again, the cry. But this time, it was different. I still couldn't hear anything but the cry itself. It didn't say anyone's name, it was just the cry. But Peng flinched hard. I saw his body jerk as if he'd been struck by a sudden jolt. His face turned even whiter, and I could see the fear etched deeply into his features. I wanted to scream, to do something, but all I could do was watch helplessly. Peng had always been the kind of person who loved deeply, and recently he had found someone special, his girlfriend. They were inseparable, and it was clear how much he cared for her. The thought of him being taken away, especially when he had finally found love, seemed so incredibly unfair. It tore at my heart. That night, after seeing the fear on Peng's face, I couldn't take it anymore. I felt a desperate need to do something, anything. So I went out alone, under the cover of darkness, and stood in the middle of an empty field. I yelled into the night, pleading for Li Yu to take me instead of Peng. My voice cracked, my throat felt raw from the shouting, but I didn't stop. I called out again and again. I was consumed by the unfairness of it all, the thought of losing my best friend just when he had found happiness. The air was still, heavy, as if the night itself was listening. And then I heard it, the flapping of wings, that same slow, heavy sound that had always signaled Li Yu's presence. It was close, circling above me. My heart pounded, my legs felt weak, but I stood my ground, waiting for Li Yu to take me. But nothing else happened. The wings faded, and the night grew silent once more. My body shook with the cold, with fear, and then I heard a harsh, raspy voice. It was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, but I understood it. Your soul has been tainted by his power. The words sent a chill down my spine. I stood there feeling the weight of those words. I didn't know what it meant. His power? I asked aloud, but there was no response. The voice was gone, and the night was quiet again. The wings faded away, leaving only the silence of the night. It seemed like Li Yu had rejected my plea, leaving me alone in the field with nothing but the cold air and my own helplessness. For days I couldn't get those words out of my head. Who was he? Who had tainted my soul? I searched my mind trying to think of who Li Yu could have meant, but nothing made sense. I didn't know then, but it would take years before I'd finally understand. A few days later, Peng got sick. At first it was just a fever. Nothing serious, or so we thought. But then it got worse. He stopped coming to the river, stopped playing with the rest of us. I'd go to his house, and his mum would tell me he was resting, that he just needed time to get better. But I knew, we all knew. I visited him the day before he died. He looked so pale, like all the life had been drained out of him. He barely recognized me when I walked in, his eyes half open, staring at the ceiling. I sat by his bed, not saying much. What was there to say? He knew it was Li Yu, we all did. The next morning, he was gone. After Peng died, the village felt different. Everyone was on edge, like they were waiting for Li Yu to come back. Years went by, and eventually, life returned to normal. People stopped talking about Li Yu, stopped warning their kids, but I never forgot. I grew up and became a shaman. It was only then, through my studies and my experiences, that I understood what those words of Li Yu meant. When Li Yu said, "Your soul has been tainted by his power," I remember standing there, wondering who he was. What power had touched me without my knowing? For a long time, I couldn't understand who Li Yu meant. I thought back to everything that had happened in my life, searching for a clue. But it wasn't until I became a shaman that I realized. The he that Li Yu spoke of wasn't some evil being, but the power of the holy shaman himself, the power I would one day inherit. Even now, after all these years, I still think about that night, about the look on Peng's face when he flinched, knowing he was the target. I miss my best friend so very much. Every day I feel his absence like a wound that never fully heals. No matter how much time passes, nothing fills the space he left behind. Peng wasn't just a friend. He was like a brother to me. And now, every time I look out at the fields we used to run through, or the river we swam in, all I can think about is how unfair it was that he was taken. How unfair it was that I couldn't save him. No matter how much I've learned, or how powerful I've become as a shaman, I'd give anything to have him back. Anything. That's the end of this video. If you like my stories, feel free to subscribe to me for more to come. See you next time and be safe.